So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you fellow journeyman, Dr. Dallas Willard.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so interesting to see how influential Socrates is and how much he taught so many people and still teaches them today without professing to know anything. See, I mean, he knew that people have to come to the truth that they can live by. He knew that they have to come to that of their own initiative. And so he called himself a midwife. Funny name for a man, but he was bringing truth out of people and assuring them that they had it in them. And one of his major dialogues is with a slave boy in the Mino, and his confidence in the capacity of human beings to achieve truth and to find their way through all of the institutions and power plays that were around them and discover as an individual that there is a God. Socrates believed in God. One reason why he had such confidence that he could work as he did with truth was he believed that there was a God who spoke to him and guided him. And he was sure of this to the extent that when they came to the point of putting him to death, he had no qualms about it, because he said, I'm going to a better place, and all I need to worry about is taking care of my soul, and everything else will be handled well. So we can certainly follow his example, and thank you for those wonderful words. Now this evening we take on the topic, is there a human nature? And the answer is yes. So we can go home. That wonderful statement that was put up again this evening by a past president, I believe, of this university: any system of education that ignores the moral conduct and the religious nature of the student is fundamentally defective. You see, as Kelly also brought out, I mean, this was the vision and the hope of all of the universities, and it still is. Let me tell you that in spite of all the smoke that is blown on this topic, people come to universities and live on universities because they want to find truth. And that's why I'm sure you came to the university. You want to find truth. And no matter what we may say in defensiveness, the need is still there. And the deepest need is for the understanding of the human self. We could have talked further about Socrates, and you remember his statement that the unexamined life is not worth living. And he meant by that the examination of the self, the coming to understand the self, and that this is the most important thing we have to do. And what we want to do this evening is to precisely examine the self, because until we're prepared to do that, we're not prepared to think about education. We're not prepared to think about curricula and the things that we lead people through. And until we're prepared to examine the self, we're not going to see the wisdom of that ex-president of this university in what he said. So we have to think about the makeup of the person. And I want to, because I might lose you in the intricacies of a few things I'm going to say, I want to just say up front, the purpose of human life is to love and serve others and to be loved and served by them. That is the purpose of human life. You don't have to be profound to see it. Watch a mother with a child. Watch how they relate to one another. Watch that little child look at its mother and almost drink in her soul and know her and love her, and the mother do the same to the child. If you look at human beings, you'll see that they live in what we can call circles of sufficiency. Circles of sufficiency. And in those circles of sufficiency, human life is completed. And when something goes wrong, we may say to a little child or to someone we love, everything's okay now. Really? Is everything okay? See, that is an ideal circle of sufficiency, of knowledge and love. Now, we all know that the mother and child is not sufficient to themselves. They require others around them. And those circles of sufficiency reach out to our neighbors, the ones that go through life with us. But the one thing that is constant is the calling and the need to know and to love, and to be known and to be loved. And we go through life with that as our calling. It isn't a deep mystery. It can be observed in life, but the problem is that all human circles of sufficiency are incomplete and broken. Even those that are most intimate and dearest. And in our world, that begins with men and women, and the problem of how men and women can be together. And if you don't have a framework within which you can take that and make it a circle of sufficiency, it turns into a living hell. And that circle of sufficiency between the basic one, between the man and the woman, is meant to be completed under God. That's why years ago Fulton Sheen had an old book called 3 to Get Married. You may remember that. It's a wonderful title. And the reason marriage is a sacrament is not because of some religious idea, but because in its very nature is at the heart of the value and goodness of life. The relationship between the parent and the child. All of these relationships between employer and employee, all of those are meant to be within a circle of sufficiency that finally concludes itself in the Trinity, which an old Puritan writer described as a sweet society in itself. God in himself is a sweet society, and his creative effort and redemptive effort is to reach out and bring those in who are broken. So I just wanted to tell you up front that that is what the nature of the human being is. It is a nature that makes loving and knowing central to human life. You know, people who have near-death experiences, one of the interesting things, all in common, is they all come back, and there are two things that they say that they want to focus on and know more about, and that is love and knowledge. Love and knowledge lies at the heart of the human being. And we have to understand that, or we can't have a basis to make statements about what education should be like. Love and knowledge go together, and they lead to being a creative will for good. And I just wanted to give you at the start a little picture of that, and then go back and go into more of the details. One of the things we have to say right at the outset is there is a human nature. And we are in a context where desire and will and freedom want to be unlimited. And in order to achieve that end, even as an ideal goal, many people have misunderstood the role of nature and have said, in order to have that as a goal, it must be that we have no nature. We've sometimes heard that in the feminist controversies, where it is proclaimed that biology is not destiny. And there's a very important point to be made with that. But in order to carry through with that point, many of our educators and thinkers, John Dewey was most prominent in this way. He wrote a book called Human Nature and Conduct, in which he denied there's any human nature. And he was after the idea that we could be endlessly progressive. But you want to understand that a nature is something everything has. And I want to give you just a statement of what a nature is. I think it's up on the screen here. A nature is a group of basic properties which determines what is possible for the thing in question. Now, not all the properties of the thing in question are a part of its nature. You might have a writing pen, for example. Whether it's blue or green is not going to be a part of its nature. But its rigidity is a part of its nature. Have you ever tried to write with a wet noodle? Right. So rigidity is a part of the nature of a pencil or a pen. And that's just, you can illustrate it endlessly, but do you get the idea now? It's a group of basic properties which determines what is possible for the thing in question. And of course, we use that in our knowledge. Imagine a library where the classification is in terms of size and color. You go to the library and say, I'd like a blue book, please. 8 inches tall and 1.5 inches thick. Now, books have color, don't they? And they have size. We actually, USC, before we redid our main library, we actually had a whole floor where books were classified by size. You know why? To save space. So that row would be for 5.5-inch books. They'd be completely full, no wasted space. But you had to have a special code to go through to get the book. So they had to cross-list them with things that were indicative. Author is important. Subject is important. Date of publication is important. You see the difference between properties that are a part of nature and properties that are not. And it's very important to understand that now. And everything has a nature in that sense. Now, not only does the nature determine what is possible for the thing in question and give it its basic structure, but rather it determines the excellence and well-being of things of that nature. Now, you might have a pencil, for example, that was not very rigid. You could write with it, but perhaps you'd have to wrap your whole hand around it or something to hold it rigid. Would you call that a good pencil? Probably not. And the reason is because its parts and its properties do not fit together to form a whole of that kind. So you'd say that's not a very good pencil. That's true of everything from a turnip to a horse to a squirrel, anything. If you know what a squirrel is, you know what a sick squirrel is, right? And you know what a healthy squirrel is. If you didn't know what a squirrel is, you wouldn't know whether it's sick or healthy, right? So now, is that second point relatively clear? The nature of a thing makes clear what the excellence and well-being of the thing in question is. And now then, I hope at this point you're going to say with me, everything has a nature. There isn't anything that lacks a nature. Everything is like that. And that's a piece of classical philosophy and wisdom that lasted well into the 19th and certainly the 20th century. You have a nature. A human being is not perchance a squirrel or a Brussels sprout. Right? You have a nature. And against that, we're judged in terms of our excellence or not. Sometimes we make fun of it. Randy Newman, of course, has the song you may remember about short people. Short people ain't got no reason. I have to pick them up to say hello. Right? Now, what's the point of the song? The point of the song is that's ridiculous. Why? Because being short or not being short has nothing to do with being human. Isn't that right? Do you see how that works? And we commonly accept that and work with it. And our philosophers, up until very recently, have generally assumed that. And we need to keep that in mind if we're going to make any sense at all of a discussion of human nature. Second slide there now you'll see has to do with some spelling out of that. What is it to have a human nature? And forgive me if this is a little slow, but we need to be careful with it. To have a human nature is to have parts with specific properties that constitute the whole person in such a way that its peculiar wholeness provides a standard for what a human being is and provides norms for how a person is to be treated and what they are to do. And you will immediately see that a turnip or a horse and a human being are different. Now, why are they different? Because they have different parts. Those parts have different properties that found different relationships between the parts that make a whole that allows that whole to fit into relationships. My father lived through the Depression. He used to tell how they had little to eat besides turnips. And one of the reasons why they had turnips to eat is because turnips grow so fast. That's one of the very few virtues of turnips, in my view. Right? But of course, if you don't have anything else to eat, you need something that grows fast. And so a turnip has a nature. Everything has a nature. You have a nature. And if we had time to go into detail, we could talk about different cases of this. I might mention Plato's Republic. Many of you will have read it, I know, in your college careers. And if you remember that, Plato says, well, there are three parts to human beings. There's reason, there's emotion, and there's appetite. Reason, emotion, and appetite. And each of these has certain properties. And because they have those properties, they relate to one another in a certain way. And for example, you want to be sure that reason is guiding your appetites by enlisting emotion on its side. Otherwise, you're going to be in total chaos. And so he lays out his theory. These properties relate to form a person who naturally lives in a social context because of those parts. And that's the other side of Plato's theory, is the republic or the city. It's how the city parts fit together because the human parts fit together in a certain way. To be good and to live well, as Plato says in that book, emotion, guided by reason, must direct the appetites to their proper exercise in the individual and society. And Plato is one of the most acute critics of democracy. He thought democracy lay right next to tyranny. You have to understand what he meant by democracy. And of course, democracy was the system that killed his teacher, Socrates. And he thought it lay right next to tyranny because democracy meant in his mind that all desires are equal. And if all desires are equal, the individual goes mad. Imagine living your life on that principle. And imagining a master desire emerging, which is able to subordinate all other desires and make them serve it. And soon you will see that democracy, in his view, would naturally lead to tyranny. Tyranny is often seen in our country in the case of people who are addicted to things. Addiction is a case of the tyranny of desire. And that means they do not have the capacity, that even the emotions cannot redirect their appetites because their appetites have become so obsessive and so masterful over their whole being that nothing can correct them. So that's just an illustration now. And we want now to approach the question, what are our parts and our properties, and how do they relate to one another to create a whole? Before we do that, we want to understand that the person who comes along and says, no nature, what that is about is the possibility of endless change. It's the possibility of endless change. To say no nature, no human nature, is to hold that human beings, there's nothing they cannot do. There is nothing that it is not appropriate to do to them. Endless change is possible. No limits. And our culture is very much tied to this. And we have to understand that a lot of the rationalization that goes into backing up this view that there's no human nature is based on the will to be able to change things without limit. It is in effect to make desire and human will ultimate. And when we do that, we run into the problem that human desire is not self-limiting. It can't control itself. Human desire has to be restrained by the capacity to apprehend reality. Experience and reason have to be able to set the limits to desire. In our life today, you'll see, for example, in commercials, the glorification of no limits. I don't know how many automobile commercials I've seen. I think all of them were advertising SUVs about no limits. And if you're just alert to this, watch the commercials that you see and see how they emphasize no limits as a model or an ideal for life. Also, camping equipment, I think I've seen advertised on that, and clothing. It is amazing in our culture the extent to which automobile fantasies are cultivated. And you get a good picture of how desire works if you watch how automobiles are advertised and what they will do for you. And what that means then is the supremacy of feeling. No nature really is a way of saying feelings. Kelly quoted the saying, if it feels good, do it. I used to have a girl that wore that on the seat of her pants. And you just wondered about maybe if I kicked her right hard and said I felt like it, if she would accept that. See, she wouldn't have worn that pair of pants if she had believed in it. She was being a hypocrite, right? Because it was only because she was in a world where people did not do things they felt they wanted to do that it would be safe to wear a pair of pants like that. But it's a fantasy. The same thing with our advertising I was mentioning. And that's where, as I mentioned last night, the supremacy of the body, abs and buns as we talk about. We focus on the body and we try to get feeling out of that will fill our lives full, or food, or other things of that sort. And yet we can't get satisfaction. I Don't Get No Satisfaction was a very famous song a little while back. I understand some people still sing it. I don't get no satisfaction. Dr. Faustus, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, is a wonderful illustration of the fact that you cannot, by desire, find fulfillment, that it will always lead you wrong. And actually, this idea of no nature comes out of the Renaissance. Pico della Mirandola had a book called The Dignity of Man. But what is interesting here is he said man has no nature because God created him that way, so he would have an infinite capacity to rise towards God. Now, actually, you have to have a certain nature to do that. But his way of putting it was to say, well, man has no nature. He can fall infinitely and he can rise infinitely. Actually, he can't do either one. But he does have a nature in which great possibilities are present if he understands that nature. And that's what I want to talk to you about, because you see, when you understand the nature of God, you realize its connection, the nature of man, you realize its connection with God, and you realize that there is an issue in here about infinity because of that relationship with God. Now, of course, nature has been falsely used, and we need to acknowledge that. Human nature has been used oppressively. What was not nature, whether it's short people or black people or whatever classification is used, that has nature arguments have been invoked to justify oppression in terms of what is just a historical accident. But one can correct these appeals only by getting the nature question right. And that, in fact, is constantly done today by those who are often say there is no nature. But they're appealing to nature in the process of doing it. And in a sense, that's the right thing to do. Now then, moral knowledge disappeared from our present world, and it has disappeared. It hasn't ceased to exist, but it has disappeared, precisely because the idea of a nature for a human being has been set aside. And if you read contemporary moral theory in the 20th century and now in the 21st, you'll see that the constant issue that is raised, like Bernard Williams, a very famous ethical writer, says, well, if we could establish an end for human beings, then we might have a moral theory. We might have moral knowledge. But as it is, there's no first-level moral knowledge on his view. And all of the writers echo that same point. Moral knowledge disappeared in the Western world, first of all, because it was said that morals is relative, that moral judgment does not apprehend a reality that is there regardless of what we think. Well, of course, if there's no human nature, there's no reality there for it to apprehend. And then relativity in terms of feelings, because people do have different feelings, takes over. Rumors that only the sense perceptible is knowable. The will and human character is not sense perceptible. And if only the sense perceptible is knowable, then of course there is no moral knowledge. Rumors that only the measurable is known, and this is where often scientism steps forward and says, well, there's no scientific knowledge of love, of hatred, of intentions, of character. And these are rumors, you see, about knowledge that sets aside any possibility of moral knowledge. The idea that moral truth suppresses freedom and diversity. That if there were moral truths, people would not be free to do what they want. Well, yes, they would be free to do what they want. they wouldn't be free to do what they want and it'd be okay. See, that's different. They'd still be free, but they'd have to deal with the fact that they were injuring their own nature and the nature of those around. The idea that everyone should be able to do what they want, as long as nobody gets hurt. That's a favorite term. In Los Angeles, we are now facing the demise of the emergency healthcare system in Los Angeles County, primarily because people do what they want and say, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. You see, I mean, that's true of nearly all of the areas of tremendous expense in public health today, is being primarily drained by people doing what they want rather than what they ought to do. Also, I mention here profound changes in the university. And I want to recommend a book by Julie Rubin called The Making of the Modern University. It is an excellent study of what happened in the university system over time in the last several decades, certainly the last century, so that there is no longer a body of knowledge to be taught about morality in the universities. And of course, these profound changes are all tied to the denial of human nature. So the outcome is actually that political correctness is the only thing that's left. Once you have set aside moral truth, moral correctness, and you will do that if you indeed think human beings don't have a nature. Once you do that, then the reason we have a big thing about political correctness is not a conspiracy of some sort. There isn't any other kind of correctness left. With human nature gone, all that is left is power, it is will, it is desire. And then politics and law rule. And politics rules law. Because instead of law being based upon a foundation of moral truth about human life, it has to be based simply upon what people desire. And judges and legislators wind up trying to reflect what they think is the sentiment of the people. Desire degrades the person to the body. And there's no foundation of dignity left for the human being. He becomes a consumer, a person who is simply striving to satisfy their desires. And Paul's analysis of Romans in chapter 1, which many of you I think will remember, where he talks about how when people turned away from the knowledge of God, they were abandoned to their own desires, and how that developed through utilizing the body. Because you see, if you turn away from a value structure that is there in reality, you turn away from God, the only thing you're going to have left to work on is your body. And you will pump that body for everything you can get out of it. And pleasure will be king. And that is what has happened in our culture. You don't retain God. You don't have a foundation for understanding human nature. And when you lose that, you simply go to what you can wring out of your body or the bodies of others.